television for serious readers.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to read a little bit, but I just want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Michelle, so much for doing this. I'm really very moved by the positive response to the book, so this is very exciting for me. So, yeah, I'm going to read from part of the book, which is later in the book, and it is, there are some slurs, which I'm not going to say, but there's a lot of, there's some maybe offensive Italian accents, which I will try to do. So yeah, this is the only chapter. This is chapter 12, which is called The Mosaic. It has the only chapter that has what are these called? Epigraphs? Yeah. So I'm going to read those first. I curse people. Everybody does it. We're human. We're bums. We're bums in the street. John Gotti. Could I have ended up being a wise guy? Maybe. Rudy Giuliani. I never prayed to God. I prayed to Gotti. Jay-Z. After John Gotti had dodged conviction 3 times, the feds finally got him. On June 23rd, 1992, the boss of the Gambino family was being sentenced. First of all, I would like to say emphatically that I am innocent, Frank Locascio read from a statement that he had handwritten in a spiral notebook. I am guilty, though. I am guilty of being a good friend of John Gotti. And if there were more men like John Gotti, we would have a better country. Locascio and his good friend and boss John Gotti had just received life sentences without parole for murder and racketeering. Gotti declined to give a statement, but his lawyer told the newspapers that he turned to Locascio and said, "We have just begun to fight," channeling Revolutionary War hero John Paul Jones. Outside the U.S. District Court building in Brooklyn, the other good friends of John Gotti began to fight. Close to 1,000 demonstrators had gathered in Columbus Park for the sentencing, some arriving on chartered buses from Ozone Park in Queens and Little Italy in Manhattan. They waved American flags and held placards reading, "Free John Gotti," "No man or government above the law," and "Another government conspiracy." A woman wearing a "Thanks John" t-shirt held up a sign that said, "Equanimity, sick, under the law." Someone played the theme from Francis Ford Coppola's film The Godfather on a boombox. Equanimity was the last thing on their minds. "No justice for Italians," yelled one Gotti supporter, who identified herself to the New York Post as Roseanne from Mulberry Street. "There's something dangerous going on in America," Michael Strapoli, a retired jewelry salesman from Queens, told the Times reporter. "Look what they got away with in the Rodney King thing. We Italians are a minority too, and we have to stand up and say this is wrong." When news of the sentence spread outside, the crowd broke through the police lines and surged towards the courthouse. "Down with the government," cried Richie Gotti, John's elder brother, throwing his fist in the air and rushing forward. Scuffles with the cops broke out. The mob smashed the windows of the U.S. Marshals' cars parked in front of the court, overturning one of them. They reached the glass doors of the courthouse, trapping the people inside for close to an hour. "A gangster version of the Bastille Day in Brooklyn," Mike McNally dubbed it in the next day's New York Post column, adding, "Only the street mob is the mob." Some even managed to get into the federal building, leading to a turbulent scene at the door of the room that hosted the naturalization ceremonies for new American citizens. "Your government is the enemy," a woman holding an American flag screamed at the people inside. McAlery recorded that this harangue was answered by one newly minted American, a Guyana-born transit worker named Maurice Noosa, who stood in the doorway with his small American flag and shouted, "I love my country," back at the demonstrators. At a press conference, Andrew Maloney, U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, scolded the media. "You made him somewhat of a folk hero," Maloney told the reporters. "You made him somewhat of a Robin Hood. And I told you on the day he was indicted, he's not any of those things. He's a murderer, and we proved that." The New York FBI chief, James Fox, said that the incident at the courthouse was orchestrated and planned, not a spontaneous outpouring of public outrage. But even if the buses may have been paid for, plenty of people were more than willing to come along for the ride. When Gotti was convicted, his daughters told the paper, "My father is the last of the Mohicans." Many people agreed. During the trial, the New York Post used a 900 number to ask if Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's former underboss who testified against him, was telling the truth, or if Gotti was. More than half sided with Gotti. Outside the Bergen Hunk and Fish Club, the bosses hang out in Ozone Park, Queens. Neighborhood denizens lined up to pay solemn respects to John's brother Peter. Just to the south, in the slightly more genteel Howard Beach, residents put up yellow ribbons like the ones people had put up for the troops during the Gulf War. And it wasn't just the lower middle-class Bargadas in the outer boroughs or an assemblage of $10 an hour idiots, as the Post-McNally described the rabble outside the courthouse. The trial was one of the hottest tickets in town, with celebrities lining the aisles. The spectators' gallery looked like Spago, the ritzy Manhattan restaurant. Gaudy guests included actors Mickey Rourke, Anthony Quinn, John Amos, and Grandpa Al Lewis, singer Jim Black, and lawyer F. Lee Bailey. Each got a wink and or wave from the defendant, the Associated Press reported. A Times Magazine cover story on the mob featured a painting of Gotti by Andy Warhol. Newsday learned that 2 prestigious law school deans had contacted Gotti, offering their services and those of their entire third-year classes to work on the Gotti appeal. Newsday also employed a fashion designer to sketch the colorful attendees' outfits, printing the standouts in a column called Gotti Garb 4 times a week. One Gotti Garb was dedicated to Fed's threads, providing a commentary alongside the drawings that highlighted the waspishness of the U.S. Attorney's outfits in contrast to the swaggering double-breasted outfits worn by Gotti and most of his backers. The civil rights lawyer William Kunstler marched at an earlier rally at the courthouse and took up Gotti's cause pro bono after House Counsel Bruce Cutler was disqualified by the judge. Oh, I'm going to have a little water. The unsophisticated nature of Gotti's crimes attracted scorn from the feds, who read Gotti's ascent as a sign of mob decline, or at least at their own success at prosecution. The quality of leadership keeps declining, Rudolph Giuliani, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, told Newsweek after Gotti's conviction. You go from a Carlo Gambino to a Paul Castellano to a John Gotti, a basic brute-level guy. This is just a mass murderer, another form of Jeffrey Dahmer, a person who enjoys killing. The tape conversations reveal that he's just a cheap thug and not a particularly bright one, remarked Ronald Goldstock, head of the New York State's Organized Crime Task Force. Of course, the feds wanted it both ways. Gotti was the godfather, capo di tutti capi, in charge of a vast empire of crime and vice, but also a character from Scorsese's Goodfellas, a street punk, a nobody, a wannabe. Although Gotti rose to be in charge of the crime family that served as the inspiration for the Corleones and the Godfather, he was certainly from humble origins. I wasn't born with 4 fucking cents. Although journalists had spun a myth about Gotti's parents as hardworking immigrants, they crossed the Hudson, not the Atlantic, in steerage class. These fucking bums that write books, they're worse than us. My fucking father was born in New Jersey. He ain't never been in Italy his whole fucking life. My mother neither. Gotti's grandparents were from Naples. The surname comes from I Gotti, the Goths, who invaded and ruled Italy in the Dark Ages. The hard-working part wasn't quite right either, according to Gotti. This guy never worked a fucking day in his life. He was a rolling stone. He never provided for the family. He never did nothing. He never earned nothing, and he never had nothing. Gotti's father did work, but irregularly and at menial jobs like construction or garbage collecting. Like his son, he loved to gamble, which made providing for the 13 Gotti siblings more difficult than it might have been. Back in Naples, he might have been called part of the Lazzaroni, the urban mob of partially employed and unemployed lumpen proletariat. Gotti Sr. did manage to scratch enough money together to move the Gotti brood from East Harlem down to Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, following the migration towards ever more suburban forms of dwelling. That didn't last, though. The family had to move to the more working-class quarter of East New York, then crawling with the remnants of Albert Anastasia's Murder, Inc., now dubbed the Gambino family after its new boss. Gotti started out in a local street gang and soon wandered into many of New York's mob-run social clubs. It wasn't long before Gotti and his first captain, Carmine Fatico, left East New York along with many other Jews and Italians. The crew moved to nearby Ozone Park, opening up a new club called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club after Bergen Street, their old Brooklyn haunt. The name was a throwback, a nostalgic nod to a slightly earlier time of white working-class New York. Of course, the white flight had been helped along by the mob's own block-busting scam. To launder heroin money, the mafia put cash into real estate fronts that gobbled up cheap houses by telling their owners that the blacks are coming. You better sell now while you can. They also told prospective low-income black buyers that they could afford their own homes and gave them cooked Federal Housing Administration applications. If they defaulted, the government picked up the bill and the fronts rebought the house in foreclosure and started over again. Even as a teen, Gotti made a powerful impression on the older mobsters, or so they told the press. He would remind me of a Caesar or Napoleon. Henry Hill, the real-life model for the main character in Scorsese's Goodfellas, would later recall. East New York and Ozone Park were in close proximity to John F. Kennedy Airport, where Gotti made a living hijacking truckloads of cargo coming from the airport. He made his bones, or was initiated into the mafia as a made man, after helping out in the 1972 slaying of James McBratney, Jimmy from Queens, who had been kidnapping local mobsters for ransom. Gotti was arrested and charged for murder, but the Gambino House counsel Roy Cohn got the charge down to attempted manslaughter in the second degree, a remarkable achievement as the man had actually been killed. The promotion of Gotti's patron, Agnello Neil Della Croce, to Gambino underboss took Gotti to the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan's Little Italy, the more fashionable address from which he started to make inroads into high society. He entered the public press after he masterminded the assassination of Gambino boss Paul Castellano in front of Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, a hit with panache that seemed almost an homage to the classic New York rubouts, Albert Anastasio in the Park Sheraton barbershop, Kid Twist out a window in the Half Moon Hotel, Carmen Galante's Last Summer, the Village Voice wrote. According to Gotti's own telling, Big Paul Castellano's slide into gentility cost him his life. He was a fucking fish in the desert. He was a fish out of water. He didn't know this life. Gotti's loyalty was always to Della Croce, a man's man, whom he felt Big Paul did not appreciate, and who died of cancer not long before the hit on Castellano. But, as with many things in La Cosa Nostra, the decision to assassinate Castellano was more pragmatic than an affair of honor. Gotti decided to whack Big Paul after a member of Gotti's crew and close friend, Angelo Ruggiero, was caught on FBI tapes talking about the crew's drug dealing. Ruggiero was given the nickname Quack Quack because he could never shut up, and the tapes were about to go public at trial. Because of the famed but irregularly enforced Gambino family ban on drug dealing, this would have given Big Paul a pretext to wipe out the whole Gotti crew. A blue-collar crew like Gotti's needed the drug money, so they got him before he could get them. After Castellano's murder, Gotti dared to venture from the red sauce coast of southern Brooklyn and Queens to such trendy, yuppified spots on the Upper East Side, such as P.J. Clark's on 3rd Avenue. He no longer walked in the side door, then everyone knew he was there, said one regular at PJ's. It was as Marlon Brando walked in, another regular told the Times. At Denoy on the Upper East Side, owned by a close personal friend, he sipped champagne with Anthony Quinn, and the two reminisced about growing up in tough neighborhoods. Taking up residence at the Ravenite, or Rusty Staub's Steakhouse on the Upper East Side, Gotti had made what Norman Podhoretz called the longest journey in the world, from the outer boroughs into Manhattan. He made the crossing from Queens to Manhattan that is the dream of every child of talent who stands on what he thinks is the wrong side of the water from the topless towers across the way, wrote the journalist Murray Kempton. Still, for all the glamour and the reputed $600 million yearly haul of the Gambinos, Gotti stayed conspicuously middle class. His favorite restaurant remained a generic Neapolitan dump in Queens, where the waiters greeted him and other patrons at the door with a challenging question, "Hey, you hungry or what?" Unlike Paul Castellano, who lived on a palatial estate on Staten Island, Gotti remained at his modest 2-story brick and vinyl siding house in Howard Beach. Every 4th of July, he threw a block party for Ozone Park's residents, replete with fireworks he set off in defiance of city codes. The FBI surveillance tapes presented at his trial revealed not an urban stoic, the last of the Mohicans, but a man who directed a constant stream of anxiety at his underlings, from worries over the bills, worries over not making enough money, and complaints over petty slights and his soldiers' lack of earning, to things as prosaic as house and car payments and insurance. Gotti: "I got nothing. Peter, me and my wife, we pay for that Blue Cross and the fire insurance on the house. Nothing, believe me." Locascio: "Blue Cross? You covered under Blue Cross? Extended coverage or something?" "Yeah, special kind of coverage, God forbid. But then the fire insurance on the house, stupid things. Forget about it. Couple of $1,000s a month, Frank." Gotti found these revelations of his interior life, with its pedestrian worries and complaints, particularly unmanning and shameful, telling underboss Gravano, "You feel like you're being raped with these tapes." Nor did it help that his lieutenants could hear him complaining about and criticizing them. He did treat himself to a cigarette boat After one of his acquittals, though, christened with the fitting name Not Guilty, he was not much of a capitalist. Unlike the model for the Godfather himself, Carlo Gambino, he did not use his ill-gotten accumulation to bequeath his children legitimate businesses so they wouldn't have to be in the mob anymore. He was caught on tape insisting on his fealty to the old ways. And this is going to be Cosa Nostra till I die. Be it an hour from now, or be it tonight, or 100 years from now when I'm in jail, it's going to be a Cosa Nostra. It may have been less about trying to stay down to earth or the desire to keep a low profile that kept Gotti in Queens than his gambling habit. He was a perpetual loser at every kind of gambling he tried his hand at, cards, sports, and especially the horses. He did have enough cash on hand to live up to one of his tabloid honorifics, the Dapper Don, the $1,800 he made sure to correct the newspaper when they misreported the cost as 1,000 double-breasted suits, the monogram Gucci socks, the silk-painted ties, the smirk, the springy shock of professionally coiffed hair that one British newspaper said was like Stalin's. At one trial, his flamboyant counsel, Bruce Cutler, declaimed to jurors that the suits were a sign of Gotti's substance. So when he sits there resplendent in his suit, it's not out of being bold. It's out of pride. That's what made this country great. The Don always had an insouciant quip for the grateful press. He showed up for one trial in Gucci loafers, but then in front of the gathered press he changed into Reeboks, more appropriate for the jailhouse, and declared he was ready for Freddie. In public, Gotti liked to play the part of the gent, holding doors, generously tipping, reprimanding his men for breaches of etiquette. The media delighted in the way he held the door for the U.S. prosecutor, U.S. Attorney Diane Jackalone. But the trial strategy he cooked up with his attorney Cutler was somewhat less gentlemanly. Cutler got one government witness to call Jackalone a slut and a blowjob. A defense witness testified that Jackalone, to entice him to testify against Gotti, gave me her panties out of her bottom drawer and told me to facilitate myself. They managed to paint her both as an uptight bureaucrat who resented Gotti's lifestyle because he enjoyed himself, and sexually promiscuous, a pervert. The trial ended in an acquittal for Gotti. Gotti liked to make grand gestures of largesse in front of TV cameras. He once gave a homeless man a $50 bill, and then when asked if he usually gave 50s to the homeless, he asked, "Was that a 50?" He took back the 50 and replaced it with a crisp C note. At one trial, he instructed lackeys to go and give cash to the homeless living in cardboard boxes on the street. After his 1990 acquittal, he practically reenacted a Roman triumph. He left the courthouse through the judge's entrance, smiling dapper like a triumphant politician, and the press and the crowd of admirers were waiting, as always, to pay homage to this man with the aura of invincibility, the New York Times reported. He raised his fist in a salute to the faithful, and they searched behind the police barricades on White Street outside the state Supreme Court and cheered his name in his victory. Even a venerable highbrow like Murray Compton could not fully resist the charisma and even dignity of John Gotti. The television cameras were fixedly staring at John Gotti, and his mien offered every satisfaction to those who inclined to detect a growth toward statesmanly proportions, Kempton wrote archly in his Newsday column. He had the look that announces the full recognition of the responsibilities just placed upon him by his fellow citizens and the entire readiness to bear the burden. At his 1990 acquittal, a maroon Cadillac was waiting for the Don to take him a few short blocks uptown to his Little Italy headquarters on Mulberry Street. Another crowd roared as he stepped out from the sedan, and several women ran up and kissed him as he strode to the door of the Ravenite Social Club, where his closest friends were waiting to offer tribute and collaborations. In the evening, Gotti stepped back out onto the street to witness the fireworks set off in his honor. He's like the mayor, I guess you'd say, a man named Joseph outside the Ravenite told the Times. He treats the people very respectably. He's friendly, and he always talks to the elderly people. He's very popular in the neighborhood because he pets the dogs and kisses the babies. Edith, outside the Ravenite, to show her support, thought the authorities were targeting Italian Americans. They always pick on us, she said. We're not bad people. We have priests, lawyers, doctors. We never killed our mothers. Why do they go after the rapists, the murderers, the real criminals? Gotti was on the cusp of being something more than a gangster. He was wooing and apparently winning public opinion. He seemed to be becoming a political phenomenon. Thanks.
So when I first found out that you were writing this book about the early 90s, I was a little bit surprised because so much of your newsletter is about both like pre-World War II and mid-century intellectual currents. So why 1992?
Okay, so basically around the time, shortly after Trump was elected, and this, I can't remember if this was before Charlottesville or shortly thereafter, I was reading all these interviews with all these alt-right guys, that's what they called it back then, people who had become neo-Nazis. And they kept talking about Murray Rothbard, who was a libertarian economist, a Jew from the Bronx, that all these neo-Nazis who had become, anti-Semites, claimed to be their first political inspiration, what got them on the road to the far-right politics. So I was researching Rothbard, and I found an essay of his, or an article from his newsletter in 1992 called Right-Wing Populism. And it was in response to David Duke's failed gubernatorial run, and it was eerily reminiscent of Trumpism. He said what the right wing needs to do is they need to find a demagogue, a charismatic leader who frightens the media, who goes directly to people, who uses television. And then the program he lined out, which was a mixture of using the state to beat up on people he didn't like, but also cutting welfare and stuff like this. And I was just amazed by this whole thing. And I was so excited about this. I wasn't a known writer at all at the time, and I tried to send this to people. I tried to send it to Jamel Bowie, who I didn't know then, and then I tried to send it to Rick Perlstein, who I didn't know then, because I thought I had found this really important document, and they didn't respond to me because they didn't know who I was. So I started writing about it. So first I started with a piece on Rothbard, and then that turned into a piece about 1992 in general, and I found out more about Rothbard's whole circle of paleoconservative intellectuals, like Sam Francis, and their connection to the Pat Buchanan campaign. And I was just, the parallels and the foreshadowing just was really so compelling to me.
So did Rothbard think that, basically, what did he think about David Duke? Did he see inspiration in it? Right, but he thought that sort of with a few tweaks he could have done
basically, it? Basically, he thought that the fact that he frightened. So he in that same piece he talks about Joe McCarthy, and he said, Joe McCarthy is a great model for right wing politics. And not because he said, all these, squishy centrist conservatives, they always say, well, he was so crude and demagogic. He was right about the communists, but did he have to be, such a crude guy? And he said, they got it exactly wrong. That's the good stuff. His menacingness, his being able to frighten liberal elites, that's what was good about McCarthy. And that's what should be emulated. And he said McCarthy wasn't that good on TV, because that was the medium at the time. But if we found somebody who was good on TV, maybe this would work.
No, obviously all the characters in the book, or not all the characters in the book, but many of the characters in the book are sort of Trumpism in embryo. But the David Duke section, there was a lot in there that I didn't know. Could you just talk about that focus group with David Duke voters? Because that's a phenomenon that obviously we've become super familiar with.
The mainstream Republican candidate, Buddy Roemer, tried to create a focus group to talk to voters about, a prospective politician. And they described somebody who had a facelift, who had never paid his taxes, who had never paid a job, had a real job. And all the voters said, we would never vote for somebody like that. And then they said, well, this is David Duke. And then the responses, they started to give excuses for every single one. They said, well, only stupid people pay their taxes, so he must know what he's doing. So he had a strange capacity to kind of fight off those sorts of comparisons and attacks.
So here, I'm just looking for this thing that I underlined, because it seemed like a sort of central question. Not just about the book, but a central question for kind of everybody who covers politics right now. So you said, we are still working to answer why the loss of faith in the old order has registered as intensified anti-egalitarianism rather than a renewed egalitarianism, why perceptions of public corruption and criminality have led to the open embrace of corruption and criminality rather than its rejection, and why discontent with the distribution of wealth and power has fostered closer popular identification with certain types of capitalism and capitalists. Do you feel like you have a better answer to any of those questions after writing this book?
A little bit. I think that basically, the assumption, the logical assumption is that, the book begins in a period where there's a very stark inequality and economic distress in American life. And the assumption you'd have is, well, under such conditions, people would tend towards, egalitarian programs, some kind of bolstering of the social safety net. I think people are seduced by a message that says, well, we live in an extremely competitive society. It's easy to fall through the cracks. It's a struggle. And the people telling you that we can build something that's more equal or take some of the sharp edges out of that competition are full of shit. You need to get in with the winners. And essentially be part of a gang or some kind of group that's just going to loot in a certain way. So I think basically there's a lack of belief in ideologies that purport to be egalitarian and more of a preference among many people for people who frankly say that the society is unfair. But that's fine. You're going to be one of the winners because I'm going to get things going for you. And that has many different manifestations. I mean, this in David Duke's mind, this is a racist philosophy. It's like, yeah, well, the free market, all this kind of stuff is sort of nonsense. What we actually have in society is a constant racial struggle. We just need to fight that racial struggle and win it. So it's different ways of reinterpreting the competitive nature, the starkly competitive nature of capitalist society, and saying we'll make you one of the winners.
So there's a story that the right tells itself and tells other people about how the New Republic specifically marginalized the far right? They often talk about William Buckley's prohibition on the John Birch Society and their kind of rejection of certain anti-Semites, at least.
Right.
And so your book kind of undermines that narrative,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely. I think a lot of other really good books that have come out recently. I mean, David Austin Walsh's book, also a little bit before that, Nicole Hemmer's book about the right-wing media have really kind of thrown a lot of cold water on the conventional conservative narrative that there was all these purges where they pushed out the crazies. Many of the people who in my book moved or were always on the extreme or far right were members in good standing of the conservative movement, friends and proteges of Buckley, worked at National Review. He would make attacks or serious attempts to distance himself from them sometimes, but those would be half-hearted and get watered down later. And this is a pattern I think you can see through the history of the conservative movement. It's notable, for instance, I mean, the National Review dedicated an entire issue to attacking Pat Buchanan as an anti-Semite. And then Pat Buchanan, a couple months later, Pat Buchanan is running for office. I mean, he's primarying Bush, and the National Review gives him a kind of tactical endorsement. So it's strange to spend time saying that this person is, tantamount to being a Nazi, but then we're going to endorse him anyway. And that pattern repeated itself when Pat Buchanan, had quite a successful run that damaged Bush, and they spent all their time saying, "Oh, he's another David Duke," and tried to connect him to the extreme right all the time, which was a fair attack. He was connected to those people, and then they invited him to the convention to give a speech. So they recognized that these people were a necessary part of their coalition, that they couldn't jettison that easily. Yeah.
Right, and then this repeats itself with the National Review's Never Trump issue.
Exactly, where you have these stentorian attacks and then they get weakened, and just a few months ago you were saying this is the worst thing that could ever possibly happen, and now you're, yeah.
So one of the chapters that I thought was most fascinating was well, the chapter that you started reading from, but the part that kind of connects what we were just talking about with what you were reading from is, Murray Rothbard and other people in that circle. I had no idea that they had such a fetishization of the mob and the kind of the mob as depicted in The Godfather.
Yeah.
So can you talk about like what they saw in that, and what how they kind of saw the Godfather as a model for what they saw as kind of something preferable to technocratic liberal society?
Absolutely. So basically, The Godfather. Well, both Murray Rothbard and Sam Francis wrote favorably about The Godfather. Murray Rothbard saw Goodfellas, and he hated it. And he said, this is what liberals think the mafia is. They're wrong. And he wrote in the same review, The Godfather was the really good stuff. And he's very taken with the romanticism about the mafia. And he says, this is what he was an anarcho-capitalist. He said, this is what an anarcho-capitalist society would look like.
In a good way.
In a good way. They're trying to follow certain rules of honor. They're defending their family businesses. They're self-regulating. So the mafia, as it's represented, it's ridiculous because the movie ends in horrible tragedy for everybody. But he wasn't paying attention to that. Sam Francis is quite a bit smarter than Murray Rothbard, and kind of was more attuned to the tragic parts of The Godfather. But he said basically The Godfather, showed a more primordial form of society that pre-existed liberalism and was more wholesome in a certain way. And The Godfather was a slap in the face of the hypocrisy of 20th century modern assumption that everybody could be assimilated into a prosperous society and without, resorting to force and fraud. And he said, The Godfather shows the truth of society. It is the mob, and that, violence and fraud are intrinsically part of politics, and we just need to embrace that.
And also clannishness, right?
Clannishness, yes. And obviously, Francis, this is what's really interesting is, Francis becomes increasingly white nationalist and I think that, his conception of what a political body should be was, bound by blood, not by abstract citizenship or something like that. Yeah.
So Rudy Giuliani, in your book, you show him taking a kind of interesting journey from kind of that. What are the German sociological terms?
Gesellschaft is the modernity, abstract law, bureaucracy, the corporation, and Gemeinschaft is community, brotherhood, feudalism, blood, so on and so forth.
Right. So Rudy Giuliani sort of starts because his father's a mobster in that Gemeinschaft.
Yeah.
Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Then he tries very hard to escape it, become like a kind of almost like a choir boy, right? I mean, he's very uptight. He's kind of hated for being so. It's hard to imagine now. It's hard that he's hated for being such a rule follower, sort of.
Yeah.
And then by the end of that chapter, he's kind of realized that he has to go back to where he came from if he's ever gonna make it in this world.
Exactly. Well, he has success in as a Fed, as a G-man, and applying the law, to these people going after the mob. He becomes very famous for going after the mob. It doesn't make him entirely popular with certain parts of the Italian American community, and that comes across and it creates difficulties for him in his first campaign. Yeah, his Mr. Clean image is a problem for him, especially among the cops who don't share the Fed's conception of law and order. And he also went after police corruption. They weren't that happy about that. And he gradually kind of starts to become re-enmeshed in this old world that he kind of tried to leave behind to join. He was a big admirer of the Kennedys, and he wrote, about how wonderful Bobby Kennedy was as Attorney General, and the story of Catholic integration into mainstream society. He was very taken with and really a part of. And then when he's running for mayor, he basically tries to run as a kind of dewy, Lindsay, liberal Republican, and doesn't work out. And the next time around, he becomes close to the police union. He becomes close to Mario Biaggi, who was a cop from the Bronx, who was corrupt, who was a congressman for many years, corrupt. He threw him in jail, and then he's out of jail, and Giuliani endorses him for trying to run for Congress again. So yeah, he
leads this riot.
Yeah, he leads a riot of cops. Just that was right, not very far from here, right at City Hall. That is very angry about David Dinkins being first black mayor of New York, also trying to institute civilian overview of the police department, trying to investigate corruption, which was very bad at the time. And he incites this riot, essentially, or he's part of the people who incite the riot. And he still goes on to become mayor. And his advisors all said, oh, you don't want to get this reputation. They call him the human scream machine. Don't do that. Go back to the liberal Republican things. And he doesn't. I mean, he, in certain ways, returns to all that good government BS and all that, I'm going to clean up the mob stuff while he's mayor and even after that. But then, if you see him now, he acts like a Batman villain. So,
right.
This is sort of like, I'm not saying that he's intrinsically that way and he couldn't escape it. I think that it's just one.
It was a choice, right?
One choice. He realized that that's sort of what he needed to be, and he did it. Yeah.
Did writing this book make you think any differently about Bill Clinton? I mean, Bill Clinton is, hated by most, especially younger leftists and even liberals, and they see all of these kind of grotesque compromises that he made and all of the ways that he triangulated. But when you're kind of marinating, thinking back to just what a reactionary time it was, a lot of those choices in context make more sense, or at least some of those choices in context make more sense.
I think, yeah. I mean, you know what? I don't have the same. I mean, I have strong criticisms of him, and I don't think highly of a lot of things he did, especially in the period of writing this book. He's not obviously the most loathsome person in this book, so it's hard to feel that strongly about him. In a certain way, he kind of struck me as a little bit of a cipher writing this book, and really going with the flow all the time, and I can't really get a sense of what he actually believed or thought. I think he had a very good feeling for politics, and listened to advisors and was cobbling together a program that appealed to people. And he was a creature of what was possible in his time, like many politicians are. He was not an epical leader who created a new democratic coalition like FDR, so he was a limited, mediocre president. I don't think he was a great villain of history, and I don't think he was a great hero either. I basically have a neutral to negative opinion of Bill Clinton after writing this book. Yeah, he's fine. He's all right. Yeah.
You make a few mentions in the book. You talk about political despair, and I sort of thought you were making a Fritz Stern reference, but then I saw in the footnotes that actually is correct. So Fritz Stern wrote this book called. He was a Holocaust scholar, or a scholar of the Third Reich, who wrote this book called "The Politics of Cultural Despair." I turned to it a lot when I was writing my first book about the right, and even though it's not really, it's this kind of literary prehistory of fascism. And I'm curious if you think, this is a political prehistory, but if that was a model for you. Yeah,
his intellectual history of the kind of strange, not so marginal, a lot of them were quite popular, but these malcontent writers who were preaching about the decadence of German society, and this is in the 19th century. When German society, was industrializing, this was under Bismarck, and the country was, becoming one of the great powers of the world, but there was this deep current of discontent with modernity, a deep, anti-Semitism, obviously, which was connected to anti-liberalism. So yeah, that was definitely in my mind. And there's also this sense that there were no good possibilities in modern society, and it had to be uprooted and replaced with something else. So I definitely thought about that. And I don't exactly take. I use it in a different way a little bit, where there's like two sides of the despair, politics of national despair. There is the people that I talk about who have this extremely revolutionary or reactionary rejection of everything, a kind of like anger and hatred. And then there's another side of the politics of despair, which is a certain resignation, or with, well, look, there's really not much better we can do. We just sort of have to bumble along and stick with the establishment, not make any big changes because the alternative might be worse.
So you've been, someone who's written about this kind of meta debate over American fascism, and the people I think who poo-poo the like fascistic elements of the MAGA movement will often say, well, you're just acting like this is some huge departure from the modern right instead of there being a logical continuity. Yeah. And I mean, your book makes it pretty clear that there's a logical continuity, but how did doing this book, and especially finding these roots in David Duke or I think it's Sam Francis, who describes himself straight out as a fascist, correct?
Half jokingly, but he's not joking.
Well, that's the kind of theme I think in this movement generally, like kidding, not kidding.
Yeah.
How does that inform the way you think about the kind of, whether or not you see fascist qualities in the right now?
I think it obviously strengthened what I thought was the case, because I thought I had lots of empirical proof. But I'll say this. I think there's kind of a higher order concept that you can use that predates fascism, and fascism is a particularly acute version of this. There is a radical right tradition of Caesarism, which looks for a charismatic, providential leader that is fed up with a parliamentary system where there's all kinds of deal making and stuff like that, views that as intrinsically corrupt. And in favor of certain types of elites, and just wants a strongman figure to break through that. So that tradition, which I think predates fascism and goes through fascism, and many of the people who imagine something like fascism even before the First World War said, "Okay, this is what we've been waiting for." I see certain repetitions of that, certainly. In this period and also today. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've just been given the signal to start taking questions. So I guess if you raise your hand, someone will come over with a mic.
Hi, Alex.
Hey, John. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. See, I got here. So I have a question that's basically, I haven't read your book yet. Yeah. Kind of the opposite of your project. After writing this book, do you see specific distinctions in the present day far right that are very different than the period you're studying, and what are they?
Yeah, I think the difference is now the country is a lot less white than it was when I wrote this book. It is a more diverse country, and even the very far right has realized that it has to make appeals that, even though they may be racist in essence, can have something to say to constituencies that are not just of old stock, Scotch Irish or whatever. So there is a kind of multiracial authoritarianism that's being brewed, which is different from this time. I mean, Perot, who is not an overt racist really, but his following was very white, and his imagery that he called upon. So that's a big change. I would say in this time, they were more civic. They were less aggressive, on the national level at least. Perot's movement viewed itself as insurgency, but was basically just Rotary clubs and stuff like that. It wasn't. It had some. There was always an aspect of really a little bit of crazy stuff going on, and paranoia, and conspiracy theories, but did not get quite so dire. It's they're some of the ideologues, yes, but I think people most people who were interested in these movements didn't quite have as apocalyptic or dark visions as some are as more frequent now. So things have gotten a little worse in some ways. Yeah, a lot of ways. Yeah.
You know, when you were talking about Gotti,
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing about Capone back in the 20s and 30s. He had that charisma and he had the celebrity. And then the 30s came and you had people like Huey Long and, you know, more of a fascist kind of mentality.
Yeah.
But it was during the Depression.
Yeah.
And the whole country, you know, had tremendous amount of unemployment and
Right.
they weren't prosperous.
Yeah.
Now you have basically a much more prosperous country, and yet this is happening. Do you have any thoughts about the parallel and why this is happening?
So, you know, Huey Long, it's interesting. I mean, Huey Long's a character in the first chapter of the book, and his sort of combination of fascists were really interested in him and gravitated to him and said, maybe this is our guy. And then gangsters also gravitated to him. I think that, you know, Louisiana was experiencing a lot of the problems that the rest of the country experienced in the Depression earlier in the 20s because it's a very poor and backwards place. I think that there is economic situation has improved somewhat. We don't live under Depression conditions, but I do believe that the kind of shared prosperity that the country experienced, and not to say it was perfect in any way, but basically from, you know, the war years up until the end of the Cold War, hasn't really been replaced by anything else. There's not the same kind of fundamental deal in which people can expect employment, good wages, raising a family, you know, sometimes on a single income, that sort of stability that people became very accustomed to and didn't last very long, but seemed to be what American civilization was all about, and only lasted maybe about 30 years, really, has not returned. So I think superficially we see, I think wage stagnation has begun to improve. These are good things. There is some improvement of these things, but I don't think we've recreated the society that existed in the middle of the 20th century yet, and I think that that's still a problem. Yeah.
Thanks. Hey, John.
Hey, Eddie.
How do you mentioned McCarthyism as kind of being an antecedent for like Duke and even Trump more in the modern right. How do you sort of square that with, like, say, the Southern Strat, right, which can be attributed to Goldwater, Wallace, or even like Strom Thurmond before that?
Yeah, I mean, I think these guys McCarthy was a very different sort of creature, and his following was kind of northern white ethnics, and there was some ethnic stuff there going on there, but yeah, I think these guys viewed their politics as a synthesis. They viewed Wallace as a big precursor. They were very big fans of Nixon's adoption of the Southern strategy, and that was Buchanan's analogy. He said, well, we took some things from Wallace, so why don't we just take some things from Duke too? I think that they said all of those approaches were what they were going to synthesize in the right-wing populism that they wanted to make. I do think what's happening in the book is that it's less a Southern than a national strategy. So some of the things that were once purely regional now become national. And like you have, this makes sense because now you see Confederate flags in places where the Confederacy never was, and where, some of the places that were big enemies of the Confederate, like in, Pennsylvania and Maine, why are there Confederate flags there? That makes no sense. But this is because this politics went national when it was previously regional.
Okay, so I guess one more question.
Oh, who's got it? Okay.
One question.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. I was sort of thinking about this idea of the romanticism scene in the Godfather movies, like the Gemütlichkeit and the Italy scenes in Part 2.
Yeah.
And even the anecdote that you ended the reading with, the woman talking about how Gotti is popular in the neighborhood because he talks to the old people, he pets the dogs.
Yeah.
It's like hard to imagine Trump petting a dog or talking to, like, kissing a baby. It's not really his thing.
I disagree. I think you see. He just the other day he's going delivering pizzas to the firemen. I think he does those retail politician stuff. He was at a Chick-fil-A and he's very gregarious. A lot of people say he's weird with people and he's got germophobia, but he's hugging people all the time. I think he's either gotten over it, he just knows it's part of politics. He's very good at that kind of retail politics. He can be and that's also what's kind of disarming about him is like, can this guy really be Hitler? He's going around and giving people hugs and joking around. Like I think he is good at that kind of American retail politics. I think he probably fucking hates it on some level. It goes home and takes a shower and is like, these people are disgusting. But like, I think that he can turn it on. And recently, especially in this campaign, I'm sorry if I cut you off, but can do a lot of that kind of stuff. Yeah, but yeah.
So hopefully this has not completely undermined my entire question. But it seems as if things are a lot more like mask off in general.
Oh, yeah.
And so people just being much more frank, like, it's a racket, I want my part of the racket, that's
right.
End of story. And so the question is, like, do you think that that's sort of like the inner truth of all the Gemeinschaftliche configurations, that they're all just sort of trending in this direction? Or is this like a real qualitative change?
I think there's not one without the other. I think that like the whole attraction of the mob is that there's a warmth as well as like the acceptance that things are a racket. It's like there's friendliness, there's a clubbiness when you're inside. That's a part of it, like it's a less lonely world. You're with your cronies and your buddies at the restaurant, and like that, the menace and the friendliness go back and forth. Like a protection racket is always like, we're helping you, but it's always like, yeah, if you step out of line, maybe you'll have a little bit of a problem. I don't know, but like, but we're friends now. It's always like this moving back and forth between menace and warmth, which you see in Tony Soprano's that way. So.
Do we have one more? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.